Dissent. It's episode 59, and today's guest is Nirish Shakya, who is a design thinking consultant, educator, and coach. So, welcome to the show, Nirish.
Thanks, Matthew. Great to be here.
Oh, no, it's great to have you on. Thank you for joining us. Today's assumption, we're going to be talking about the idea that you should focus on your craft. And I think this is a piece of advice I've been kind of given throughout my career. It kind of sits alongside don't rock the boat kind of advice. Don't ask too many difficult questions. Often feels like it's really telling me to ignore something uncomfortable. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this and exploring this a bit more today. If you happen to be new to the show, Delightful Dissent is a shared exploration of something that people tend to take for granted, an assumption that people often kind of goes without comment or thought. It's an idea that came about through my work, talking to people taking different pioneering alternative approaches to tricky, complex problems. And Nirish is definitely one of those people. And I found in these conversations that there were often these kind of strange hidden barriers around these implicit beliefs, these deeper assumptions. And I really wanted to bring those to light and talk about how true they really were. So I hope this show gives you specific ideas about the things that can help you in your personal and or professional life. But perhaps more importantly, I really hope that this show gives you ideas about how you can go out there and challenge assumptions yourself. Because I would like everyone to be able to do this and it to be a completely normal part of our existence and particularly our work. The show is called Delightful Dissent because, it is about kind of, taking a different position, taking a different angle and saying, okay, maybe this isn't true. But it's not about proving ourselves right at everyone else's expense. And it's not about taking it too seriously. It's about having some fun and playing with alternative possibilities and perspectives. Now, the show is genuinely live, so there may be difficult topics and there may be strong language. The topics today are likely to be around probably unintended consequences and workplace harms. So if either of those are difficult for you, then or strong language is a problem for you, then please be warned that that's a possibility. There aren't any perfect answers here. This is about exploring. It's about asking questions of yourself and of us and of other people. If you are watching live, then please do comment with any questions and we will try and include them in the conversation. If you are watching or listening to the recording, we will be sharing information about how you can get in touch with either of us and continue that conversation at the end of the show. So, I first met Nirish through Happy Startup School, I think, and I was particularly struck by really his as well as just a very enjoyable presence and person to be around, really this very skilled, emotionally informed approach to design and working with complex design problems. And I really wanted to get him on the show and share some of that with you. So in the audience. So Nirish, could I ask you to maybe introduce yourself, please, in your own words and your work and the people that you like to work with, perhaps?
Sure. Thanks for that generous intro, Matthew. So just to clarify, when I say I'm a designer, I'm not a visual designer. So I don't work with things like graphics and making things look pretty, which sometimes make me feel like, am I even a real designer? I mostly tend to work with, I guess, designing experiences and services for people. How do we make it easier for people to use the products that the proper designers actually design? And how do we make it so that people don't get frustrated with any of the products or services and environments they're currently in, trying to cater to the needs of as many human beings as possible. So I actually started off as a developer, as a coder. This was back in Sydney, I think more than 15 years ago now, because I did my undergrad in computer science. And after my degree in computer science, the traditional pathway is to get a job as a developer, which I realized that I wasn't very good at. I wasn't very good at coding. I didn't have that left brain power to do that. And I realized that I actually enjoy working with people more than machines. And I also remember this one time we were building this application. It was a touch screen based application, and this was way before the iPhone came out. And just showing my age there. But we're basically building this touchscreen navigational application that the police or security companies or delivery drivers would use in their cars and vans. And the way we built that application was we would get requirements from our clients, and we wouldn't question most of those. We would literally just code it as fast as possible and ship it as fast as possible. And without even considering who was going to use this product, why are they using this product, what kind of problems we're solving for them. Because we were like so deep in the trenches to even ask those questions. And we didn't think that it was even necessary to ask those questions. And I remember it was only when these people, they couldn't use the product and they had to complain about the product that we would hear from them. They'd be like, oh, I can't press this button. This doesn't make sense. This is too small. This is too big. And the only conclusion that we got to around that time was that these people who are complaining must be stupid. Right? Because I didn't know any of the techniques that I use now as a human-centered designer to build product and services designed around the needs of humans. And it was only when I did my postgrad on interaction design that I actually finally realized, you know what? There's actually a better way to build products and services, which is by starting with the humans in mind, not with technology, not with business, but with humans. And I couldn't go back to doing the things I was doing before, where I was just constantly building and shipping things without ever bringing the human into the picture.
Mm.
And that's where I actually started my journey as a human-centered designer.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating, it's very close to my own journey as well, and experience of having spent a whole load of effort and constructed a whole load of stuff to deliver really big services, and then finding that no one really wanted them as they were and didn't like them, and that they didn't meet the need that was expected. Having spent quite a lot of effort and having some really clever, engaged people building the services as well, it was just this weird paradox. And understanding this, I think, is a really helpful thing. And I love that focus on experience as a totality. And I think this will probably come back to the importance of this, and the difficulty of taking things in isolation and what can go wrong with that a bit later on. Just one more question about you before we really dive into that, though. And so, what kind of clients do you like to work with? What's your kind of favorite kind of clients to work with?
So I would say clients that are actually working on multi-touch point journeys, who I guess have that awareness and maturity to know that these journeys, these services, these experiences happen not just on your website you're building or on your app or a storefront or a restaurant, but these happen across multiple both physical and digital touch points. And clients who have that awareness, it just makes it easier for us to then, I guess, bring different stakeholders together to actually look at the entire end-to-end picture, the big picture, as to how people traverse through their different touch points and different customer journeys, and where can we make that biggest impact. Because a lot of times, a lot of companies, I guess, don't have that maturity, and they have siloed teams working on very isolated streams of work, which don't really talk to each other, or they're very disjointed. And that's when it doesn't matter how hard you work to make that one touch point perfect. If customers coming into that touch point from another touch point which is less than perfect, and then going to another touch point which is again doesn't work that well, that overall entire journey is pretty disjointed, and that overall satisfaction will be much lower, right? So a lot of times I realize that all the effort, the energy you spend tends to go to waste. And you only realize this in hindsight when you've put all the energy on building something and realize that it doesn't really impact the customer's experience.
Yeah, it's that idea of things working together in again, as a coherent set of experiences, rather than as kind of a locally perfected, most efficient thing, is a real challenge for a lot of organizations, I think. And that you're right, it does actually require a almost completely different way of thinking about how we're delivering these things and services.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of that does come from our training as, whether it's you're a designer, problem solver, innovator, whoever you are. I think our training teaches us to zoom in early and stay zoomed in, which means that we're not sticking our head up to see what's happening around us and trying to kind of soak in the big picture. And we're not really paid to understand the big picture, or maybe we just don't have the time or the capacity to do it a lot of times. And that severely restricts the overall impact we can have with the effort we're spending. And I think that's something that I only realized later in my career, that the impact you're having, the return on your investment of time and energy, is not directly proportional to how much energy and time you've spent. It's actually more proportional to where you're spending the time and money, that time and energy.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think we definitely return to that. I think we're getting very close to getting into the assumption now. So just before we do you have a quote that you'd like to share with us, the kind of, to start things off?
So this is a quote that I tend to share with my students when I teach human-centered design. And because in a lot of my courses, I tend to focus a lot on the actual craft, teaching the craft of how to, perform different methods and use different tools to be a researcher and a designer. That spans, researching customers, interviewing, prototyping, testing, all that jazz. But the quote that I'd like to share, especially when people are in the prototyping stage, when they're building fake mock-ups of the real thing, is something called Sturgeon's Law. Have you heard of it, Matthew? Yeah.
Yes.
So Sturgeon's Law states that 90% of everything is crap, right? So, and I took it by heart the first time I heard it, because I think if you think of it like with 90, if not think of it, but it's like statistics say that 90 to 95% of businesses fail in the first 2 to 5 years. If you have a smartphone, you probably don't use 90% of apps on your phone on a regular basis. I don't remember what they are. Like, I downloaded them like 10 years ago, right? But still, they're still there.
My current phone has a feature where it tells me that I haven't been using apps, and I'm like,
okay.
Oh, I completely forgotten that was it. It's like we've kind of put this app to sleep because you haven't used it for 6 months. It's like,
yeah.
Oh yeah.
I think the new phones tend to do that. But a lot of times we tend to stick to, like, I don't know, 10, 15 apps that, we regularly use. And the same thing with, I guess, ideas, our ideas, right? We have, we might have lots of ideas, but according to Sturgeon's Law, most of them will be crap ideas. And same thing in my case. Like, I tend to get a lot of ideas, but most of my ideas are really, really bad. So same thing applies, I think, to our craft as well. I think because we're so hyper-focused on using our craft to solve problems, the thing is 90% of the time we're not either solving the right problem or not using our craft properly on the right thing that actually has impact.
Yeah, it's interesting. It also, for me, it almost feels linked to what you realize when you do any mindfulness practice. When you start looking at the thoughts, is I think you can probably apply Sturgeon's Law to most thoughts
Absolutely.
as well.
It's
like,
most
that
of what we
isn't a
think.
helpful thought right now.
I mean, I was meditating this morning, and most of my thoughts were just garbage, just noise.
Yeah, this is rubbish. This is crap.
Very irrelevant, right?
And I think, for me, part of what we mean by crap is a poor fit. It's not a judgment in absoluteness. It's just this isn't the right thing for right now. And I think it's a really important thing for me in how I think about this, to separate. There's a slightly moral idea around doing something shoddy or doing something incomplete, Whereas actually it's about, is this helpful now? And to get into this assumption, this idea of focus on your craft, I think for me, one of the big challenges to that idea is very often I work in uncertain, rapidly evolving spaces. And actually doing something that's just good enough isn't crap, is the best answer. And not like delivering something perfect that's too late or too expensive is actually a very bad answer to the question. And so I think for me, there's something really interesting in this. But with that assumption, with this idea of focus on your craft, what is it that, how do you hear that? How does that come over for you in the messages that you hear and the things that you're exposed to?
I think that's the first thing that we hear when we are learning to be a valuable member of the society, right? Look at, like, let's take our, go all the way back to school. What are we doing? We're learning craft, right? We're learning how to gain the skills and the knowledge so that you can use the skills and knowledge for the benefit of society. And that requires craft, right? And craft is very important. But I think what's happening now is we are still entertaining the legacy of the industrial era where, Taylorism was the thing that determined that, we need to create efficient workers as efficiently as possible who know their line of work and who can do it as fast as possible, get the production line moving as fast as possible, and who don't question things. And I think we have been conditioned in that kind of education system, which we then bring into the workplace, where we think that our main goal, our main remit, is to use our craft as efficiently as possible to do the things that we've been told to do. And I think therein lies the challenge for us in terms of how can we be aware of that, right? Be aware of that conditioning, and maybe take steps to do something about it.
Yeah, I definitely agree that this. I think of it very often as a focus on output. It's how can we create the most output, and assuming that the outcomes are going to kind of take care of themselves, and that actually when you really look at any of it, it doesn't make sense just to do stuff for the sake of doing stuff in that way. Partly because there's an opportunity cost. We could be doing something else. And partly because we're in a situation where we're aware of quite significantly limited resources available to us, and that everything that we do consumes some resources. So if it's not paying off in terms of a beneficial outcome, it's actually kind of a problem. So when people do focus on the craft, when this message is used, what happens? How does this message kind of affect what we do?
I think the metaphor that's coming to my mind is you have a machete or an axe and you're being dropped into the middle of a jungle on some island, and you've been taught how to slash the machete in any whatever direction you go into, right? And just to find your way through the jungle. And you do that because that's what you've been trained to do. But not every trail you follow in the jungle will take you to the right destination. And not everything you slash and destroy in the forest will have the right impact. So just because you have the tools, for example, to conduct research or to conduct or design or prototype something, doesn't mean that you might be going in the right direction, or doesn't mean that you're actually working on the right things. A lot of times we either don't have the time to do it, to again zoom out and see where on the island we're actually heading towards, and whether our direction is actually towards the right things that actually aligns with our values or the company's mission, because we're just too busy to do that.
I think this link to busyness is a really interesting one. This idea of needing to do something all the time, particularly in organizations, and particularly in helping organizations, actually. I see this very often in purpose-led organizations. It's a pattern I've started to call something must be done, so I've done something. But those two things being completely unrelated, or just hoping that you're going to get, it's like, and actually this idea of being busy, needing to just produce without that relationship to why, or on both a practical level and on a felt sense level, on an intrinsic reward level, is a message is a very strong cultural message. Certainly in a lot of the organizations I've worked, and I believe it's probably even more profound in the US as a message. But I think that busyness, it almost feels like a compulsion. It's like it's almost addictive. It's like we're afraid of what will happen if we're not busy, constantly producing.
Absolutely. This kind of reminds me of an organization I was working for, and where every team was pretty much fighting for their right to exist in the organization, and each team had to prove their worth to the organization, saying, "Hey, look at how useful and valuable we are to the organization," right? And a lot of times, the way to do that is to just show how busy you are on just ticking the boxes. And a lot of times you're ticking the same boxes as another team that's working on the same thing. But it doesn't matter as long as you're ticking the boxes, right?
And I think when you start to reify busyness like that, it actually, and particularly when you start to reward it, it sets up some really perverse incentives in an organization. Because what we are trying to do to be truly, to really find an intersection between effectiveness and efficiency, is to do valuable stuff as efficiently as possible. But when we just do the busyness and focus on that kind of, okay, we can do this. This is our thing. This is our craft. We can do this really, really well. It almost leads us to doing it in ways that increase the amount of just doing it. It becomes almost this feedback loop where we end up acting in ways, creating situations where there is more busy instead of where there is less busy. And if the organizational incentives make us do that, we actually make these processes harder for both our own staff and for the end users to engage with, because we're increasing these number of steps that don't actually have any value, that always have, every trade-off has losses, every step has losses. So we're increasing this and building this in. And I definitely, interacting with a lot of organizations, I've been like, it's like you kind of find whole departments sometimes that just exist because their existence is predicated on doing stuff that they are making necessary in the first place, if you see what I mean. It becomes this feedback loop. And I think it's actually a real danger for organizations in all sorts of ways. Both commercial organizations, it's a threat to commercial viability. Public organizations, it's a threat to service user well-being primarily.
I mean, this happens quite often in government departments as well, where probably the entire department is set up to just do work that technology can so easily replace, but they don't do that because obviously you don't want people to lose their jobs, even though if you were to replace their jobs with something more meaningful to them, it might be better in the long run. I was working for a finance company where they had the system that didn't do any error checking. So for all the data that was being entered by humans, and so there was an entire team set up to just do error checking for the data that was being entered by these traders, right? So when we went in and tried to improve the system, they were really scared that the work they were doing to improve the system would mean that their jobs will be obsolete, where they're just currently just purely manually checking errors, which the technology can easily do much faster. So there's definitely a lot of, I guess, human fears involved in organizations as well, which I guess prevents us from, again, zooming out, taking a step back and see what else is out there. What are the other possibilities in which we can be spending more time to deliver that impact?
I think that's such an important point. There is that fear of it. There's a weird paradox in there. It's like it feels like there's a fear of meaninglessness, but that we meet that fear by doing meaningless work.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess it is actually. It's a feedback loop. Yeah, and I think there's something very much in the psychology of how we run organizations and think of ourselves as individuals, and particularly in terms of management. That idea that actually if you just trust people to figure out like a useful thing they could be doing that is aligned to their values and their skills, they'll often find something really, really valuable, really high value. It just won't be what you thought of. And that is a challenge for managers. And I think that idea of shifting to, and it's, I also think of this in terms of, things like the agricultural revolution. It's like, I am incredibly pleased that I don't have to work in a field for 12 hours a day to feed myself. And, to like, that work is backbreaking and makes, and miserable. Similar with mining for many people, all of these kind of traditional things. The fact that we've replaced many of these things with automation is a healthy thing, as long as we just allow people to then find and develop something else in their place. And I think that development perhaps is the gap, is we really struggle to change, particularly where something's been successful before.
Absolutely.
I think that's a huge fear. It's like, well, this works. It's like, yeah.
But we think it works. Like, for example, it's comfortable to just focus on our craft because that's what we know. It's comfortable and we know it gets the job done, ticks the boxes. But it's very hard for us to see what's beyond that. What if we stopped using our craft? What if we were to learn new craft that will actually help us do something different? That difference causes a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear. Like, what if it doesn't work? I'd rather just stay safe in what I know that I'm good at.
And what if it doesn't work is an important question. I think it's something we should ask ourselves, but it shouldn't be. Very often I find like there are a whole set of questions, this one included, that are important questions to answer that are often used instead as reasons not to do something. So it's like, yes, we should take what if it doesn't work into account, particularly if we're working in an environment where people depend on what we do. You know, we can't, if we work in, healthcare or aerospace, it doesn't make sense for us to do completely untested random things. And, no one's pushing everything. This isn't a recommendation to push like a complete change into production and see what happens. That's not a healthy thing to do. However, we should be informed by what if it doesn't work and what if it does work, which is the other side of that. And I think often the fear is there, actually, is what if it does work? What does this mean? How do we integrate all that's changed, all of the implications? Because I think I think that this focus on your craft message for me is very much about ignoring implications. It's very much about working in your area and letting someone else take care of something else. And whilst there is value in that to some degree, we need to be able to link up. We need to be able to connect. And I really like that you mentioned this kind of multidisciplinarity. And I think it's really interesting. How do you see some of that playing out in organizations? Are there particular people who can work in this space and bridge these gaps in organizations?
This reminds me of a time when I used to be hyper focused on my craft as a designer, and this was especially during the early stages of my careers, where I had to prove myself, in the industry, in the organization. So I basically used to take the brief and work day in and day out to get that brief done, do the designs, and hand it back to the clients. And I think after like 2 or 3 years in the industry, I learned a new technique called design studio, which is basically you invite your colleagues, your stakeholders, from different disciplines into the room, and then you present not your solution, but the problem to them, right? And then we basically spend like 90 minutes to an hour just solving the problem together, co-creating a solution to the problem together. And for me, that was a bit of a game changer because, well, first of all, it was really challenging for me to let go of my craft, of being able to do the whole thing myself, and let other people be part of that craft, not knowing what solutions they're gonna come up with, right? And also, what I realized was that when I let go of my need for control through the use of my craft that I thought other people didn't have, I was allowing the emergence of more diverse perspectives and diverse ideas that I didn't have. Doesn't matter how hard I use my craft. And I think great organizations, the most innovative organizations, have created these kind of channels, for collaborative co-creation and problem solving intentionally within their teams. That allows, I think, for these diverse perspectives and ideas to just emerge. And I think our responsibility as designers, problem solvers, innovators, whoever we are in an organization, I don't think it's individual responsibility. I think we should take it as part of a collective responsibility to solve problems, so that you don't feel the pressure and the anxiety of having to use just your craft to come up with all the solutions that you can. I think it's more of a collective responsibility.
I really like that as a cultural shift, that idea of not being alone in solving a problem, and very often this is, and I also really like that you brought in actually collectively deciding on what the problem is, because that's a really important part of this, getting everyone in there. How do we understand the problem? Because we understand the problem from different perspectives. And that can be a really challenging part of this. Is like, okay, this is a problem for me but it's a problem for you for a completely different reason. And if I solve the problem from my perspective, first of all, it certainly won't make your problem any better. And actually, I might end up shifting more stuff into that problematic area for you. So I might make it worse. And understanding that, the whole problem space as a thing that we can kind of collectively work on really challenges a lot of these ideas around just delivering and kind of this idea of a perfect solution, the perfect execution is actually, it won't be perfect in those terms. And, bringing other diverse perspectives in, integrating the ideas that you don't fully get, working at the edges of your ability too, that won't create this kind of idealized perfect thing, but it will create something that is more effective across the whole problem space, rather than kind of solving and ticking off. It's like, that's not a thing anymore, because it just doesn't, like, any complex problem just doesn't work that way, because they're always interactions. It's always held in that. So I think that's such helpful advice, and us as individuals letting go of the idea that we need to solve it all ourselves is actually a really liberating thing, and quite a challenging thing, I think, for a lot of professionals. We're kind of taught almost this focus, like, this is your space, this is your and the specialization, and you excel here and no one else. It's like, and there is a both and here, because I think this is one of the other things I've learned is, I want to be able to share what I know and my expertise with users. And I think this is one of the, you touched on this earlier, is actually being able to question people about their requirements is a really important thing in this process. We want to be iterating on both sides. We both want to be able to understand better. And I've often had like a whole load of kind of requirements as almost like a pre-designed solution from clients, and been like, why? What's the outcome that you want out of this? Because they have their own knowledge and their own domain, and I can contribute to that. Say, well, okay, this might fit better. This might work better in this domain. It's like, or this is a more achievable way to reach, an easier way to reach the same outcome, or whatever it is. But there's that integration of all of the experience and the knowledge, I think, rather than it being one person trying to hold everything.
Absolutely, yeah. And I love how you mentioned, the importance of asking why. And a lot of times that is not really considered part of our craft, to question things. A lot of times we think of our craft as tools to help us just do things that we're being asked to do. But I think it all starts with that question, why? Why do we even bother?
Yeah, I think this is, it really makes me think of Maslow's hammer in this, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And we need to be very careful as very skilled hammerers in a certain domain.
Is that a word, hammerers?
It is now.
Now it is.
That we're not just seeing everything as a nail for our particular hammer.
Yeah, I think that's making me think maybe we need to broaden our horizon as to what we consider craft. Like a lot of times, us designers, we think of craft as, very technical skills that help us produce beautiful outputs, right? And maybe being able to talk to your colleagues, your stakeholders, is also part of that craft. Maybe being able to stand up, speak up in meetings, and question the decisions, that could be a craft you can learn, right? Just like any other craft. Maybe our capacity to step out of all of it and question the impact, for example, our work is having on the planet, that could be craft, right? A skill you can learn. So I'm thinking craft is not just what you do, but also how you think and how you see the world.
It feels like applying the concept of craft to outcomes rather than outputs. How do we work with them in those ways?
Yeah. And even the impact of those outcomes.
Yeah. The kind of ongoing, the outcomes of outcomes, as it were. Yeah. I think the other part of it that really comes up for me is the your part of it in that in this thing. It's like, that's very lonely, and it's also very kind of isolated. So it's actually, it's focused on our craft collectively. It's like, what are the combined outcomes that we can create, and how can we bring about really good ones that are desirable for everyone?
Yeah.
And I think the other part of this that I would like to bring in is introducing and perhaps reintroducing our own personal needs in this. Because there's this, for me, one of the difficulties of this focus on your craft thing is one of the things it's often about ignoring is, well, what else is going on? Why is it difficult for me to focus on my craft? What are my unmet needs in this situation across all different forms? And I think this links to some degree what we can do about this in terms of how we're working, and how we can start enacting this. Because if this is all at the edges, it feels like a lot of this is about the edges and the difficult kind of the overlaps and integrating those, making those make sense with each other. Is how can we do that in our own work? Is our work raising edges for us? Is there something that makes us uncomfortable in this work? And what could we shift to resolve that?
No, I totally agree.
So if we're, and I think it's, we talk about human-centered design, but the human's quite abstract in a lot of the conversations about human-centered design. For me, I'm really interested in this idea of designing for oneself first, and actually understanding, putting yourself, your own living being and experiencing back into the process, and accepting with all that comes. So I have my own limitations of perspective, of ability, of all of those things.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I mean, and as human-centered designers, we're very good at using the tools and the skills we have to create a relatively very clear picture of the humans that we're helping, that we're designing for, that we're creating these products and services for, right? We've got tools like interviews and customer journey mapping and personas and whatnot to really be clear as to what are these needs that we're trying to meet, what kind of goals we're helping these people trying to achieve, and how can we do that, right? But a lot of times we don't tend to use the same methods and tools as methodically on ourselves, because we don't think we are important enough, right? We always think our users, our clients are more important than us, right? We're just here to serve them, which it's a helpful attitude to adopt in a lot of circumstances, that we're here with a serving mindset. But I think taking to the extremes, it makes us unaware that we are also part of this system, and we're not just building this product or this service just out of pure selflessness, that we just want to just help and nothing else. We also have our own needs that we're trying to meet as well. A lot of times we're not aware of those needs. And sometimes we work on things that don't meet our needs. And we're not aware of that. But we sense frustration and anger and disappointment, but we don't know why. Right? For example, I was part of the Happy Startup School program last year. And as part of that, we had to do some work to understand our own needs. And one of the needs that came up for me, that comes deep from within me, is this need for serendipity and play, right? And now, reflecting back on the jobs I've had as a designer, I never pursued a job or a career because, hey, this one offers more serendipity and play, right? I basically looked at what is the job title? Does it sound fancy? Is it for a fancy brand, right? And does it pay me good money?
And also, do they have the resources so I can have the fine? It's, you know, when we're talking service design, it's more abstract, but it's like the finest materials. You know, it's like I can get the finest paints and the finest paintbrushes, and the sharpest chisels and the best stone, whatever it is. But that applied to service, it's partly that. You know, it's like I will be happy because I can do this really refined create these really refined outputs.
Yeah. And what I realized was that, at this one time I went for an in-house role where, it was really good, position, good salary, it was a good brand. But then every day you go in, you work on the same thing, you go out, come back the next day, you work on the same thing over and over again, right? And it didn't give me any opportunities and moments for serendipity because I knew what I was going to work on every day with who. There was no spontaneity in the whole process, which meant that by the end of my time there, I was just like severely exhausted mentally and emotionally because one of my core needs was not being met through that role, even though it might have been meeting my other needs, maybe my surface level needs, but some of my deeper needs for serendipity and play were not being met. And if I had known that earlier, then I probably would have tried to deliberately, find out whether that role would have opportunities to meet my needs around serendipity and play. I would maybe like ask people in the interview, maybe my HR like hiring manager, and try to find that out before making the decision to then take on that role. So I think in hindsight, I would have saved so much time and energy not getting distracted by every opportunity that comes my way if I had been clearer with what my needs were and pursue the ones that actually would help me meet those.
And I think one of the interesting things for me around this is how much more we deliver for other people when we also meet our needs at the same time.
Absolutely.
How higher quality work is when we're in our, we do uniquely valuable work when we can join those up. Whereas if we're doing this kind of, on some level, this idea of focus on your craft almost feels like focus on a completely consistent output, which is useful in some circumstances, but is very, you mentioned this, the factory metaphor, for this kind of work. And when we're talking about change work, knowledge work, it's actually a very poor metaphor. And I really like where you've, that connection to thinking about this as a craft in terms of the bigger picture, because that's an important part of this. I think, being aware, doing the work to be aware of one's own needs and how one might want to meet them actually becomes part of the craft. We can kind of allow ourselves the development and the space that we are offering others.
Yeah.
And in doing so, we actually increase our capacity to offer that to others.
Absolutely.
There's that fear that we're taking from others, I think, if we're meeting our own needs. Whereas actually what we're doing is we're creating a situation where the overall, that the systemic versus the local thing, where actually we're increasing the benefits to the whole system more than we're taking from the other person.
And that kind of is making me think now whether we need to have craft for both external work and internal work.
I'm not entirely convinced they're not. They're kind of two sides of the same thing. I think of this.
But a lot of times we focus on just one side.
And we almost always focus on the outside. And it can also lead to quite superficial work. And, I think that superficiality we've touched on with tick boxes and, it's like, if we're connected to it as an organization and it's actually part of us, first of all, it's easier because it just comes about because of us in some way. It doesn't require that effort to be different to be different to who we actually are. But it really, it becomes a more, it just connects that inside and outside. It connects who we are as a group of people working together with the work that we do and the circumstances that we are working in. And an acceptance of those, including the downsides. And that, I think, is actually a really healthy thing for everyone involved. Rather than this idea of being able to create these perfect outputs without, as a kind of almost like as a kind of disembodied separate entity. It doesn't reflect the underlying reality.
Absolutely. And like, I know, like you're an advocate of long-term thinking, right? And you talk about how, how valuable it is to think long-term to make sure that the work we're doing actually has long-term impact positively. But a lot of times, we find teams and companies, focusing on just this quarter or the next quarter or next year, just like very kind of short-term metrics that we're trying to hit. And when that happens, companies don't really care whether you grow as an individual or not, because they know that you're only there to help them hit those metrics for this quarter or the next, right? So how do we also maybe encourage organizations to treat people in a more kind of long-term manner rather than just like short-term resources? Which in some cases might be true. Like people might just be joining a company for like 6 months, a year, a couple of years, just to kind of help them complete a project. But in a lot of cases, especially with full-time employees who've been there for a while, maybe there needs to be structures for them to help them understand themselves better and see the big picture, right? For example, I was working for an organization where I had a bunch of people who would report onto me, and a lot of times, the bosses and the managers that I've had, they tend to basically, when in our one-to-ones, we talk about just the project we're working on. But this one time I basically changed it so that we're not thinking about what we're working on, but we're also thinking about what they would like to work on in the future, even in the long-term future. So I use this little tool called the Shape of Designers or something like that. It was created by my friend Jason Massoud. He was actually writing a book with the same name, like Shaping Design. And it's basically like a little quadrant where you can draw your own shape as a designer. So where are you good at? For example, you might be good at prototyping, but not so much as research and not so much at business strategy. So you can draw your shape. And then I basically, ask my direct reports to draw their current shape, and then also draw what shape they would like to be in the next 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. And they would draw that shape. And then a lot of times I realized that that shape will not be achievable in the company they're working at, right? So instead of saying, hey, don't worry about this, just focus on your craft now, just what you need to do, I would actually encourage them to pursue opportunities that would help them grow the areas that they're not good at currently. And even if it means that they would have to leave that role and go to another company. And in some cases, they did that, right? Which wasn't good for me and my team because I had to then rehire and go through the whole process, but it was good for the person, right? And yeah, sometimes you just need that kind of, I guess, long-term thinking, and also thinking from the perspective of your employees and people to be able to do that.
I think for me, I've done a fair bit of work that results in similar, and actually, it is good for the organisation that people whose roles aren't fitting them leave if it doesn't make sense to change those roles. And I think a lot of organisations miss out on a significant degree of opportunity, particularly around innovation, where it's like, actually, if you just let people kind of follow and develop those ideas, those capacities, you would have a completely unique offering in the marketplace that would be, put you in a move you towards a place where you're much more sustainable as an organisation, where your ongoing viability is ensured much longer. Because we're in an environment where a lot of organisations actually don't last very long. They're essentially one-trick ponies. And being able to develop that as an organisational capability is a really important part of this for people that actually want to be in this longer-term thing. And I think both for individuals, it's an important part of it, and also for investors, is thinking, if you're investing in a company that's working quarter to quarter and you want to make a long-term investment, you shouldn't be investing in that company. It's not going to give you what you want in the long run. It's going to go up very quickly and then it's going to go down very quickly. And I think understanding that, it's not going to give you what you want. And I think part of this on both sides is being more explicit, and creating situations where we can be explicit about what we want. It's a weird thing when you apply for a lot of these organizations that actually are very short-termist, is to be able to succeed at interview. You need to talk about how this particular thing is exactly what you wanted to do for your entire life and is exactly what you will want to do for the rest of your life, and we all know that game. But if it isn't true, we shouldn't be asking people to do it. Organizations should be upfront, and individuals should, because they have the ability to invite that and say, okay, well, this is a project, this is a domain we think we're going to be working in for the next couple of years. Join us if you want to be working in this for the next couple of years. And then we'll see. Do you want to develop into something else? And we've got a lot of capacity to do that. Or will we shake hands and say that was great working together and go somewhere else that's doing something that's a better fit for you then?
Treat it as an experiment.
Exactly. And I think allowing this, and this idea of people whose jobs don't make sense, people whose CVs don't make sense, who've job hopped, who've done things outside of the domain that we're working in, they're often the most valuable employees, particularly when we're in innovation and complexity, because they have mental models that other people don't. They can use analogy from a different domain. So much of innovation comes from just applying a pre-existing model from one domain to another domain.
Absolutely.
And so much of organizational resilience, actually, being able to spot problems, saying, well, this was a problem. This was a problem for this group. This isn't exactly the same, but they're both huge aspects.
Yeah.
So being able to focus on that as a capability, I think, developing that and highlighting it. And I also think, promoting people, developing this as a capability, saying this is a thing that we do and an important part of how we run the organization, instead of just focusing on that fixed output, is a really, really important thing to do. And I think we can do it as individuals. We can focus on that and move. And I hope in the long term that just means that, I think successful organizations will rise when they do this. But there is a limit. And I think, we've got to balance the short term and the long term. But being able to make sure that we're getting a bit of both in each thing, individually and organizationally, feels like a good step in that direction, and saying, yes, Craft is important, but so are other things.
They're kind of striking the balance, or trying to strike the balance between exploration versus exploitation.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And I think, when we talk about focus on your craft, what we often seem to mean by that is it's only exploitation that matters.
But what you're exploiting, the resources will run out one day, right? So
Exactly.
that's where the exploration side is so important to also bring into the picture once in a while.
Absolutely. We want to balance. We want to kind of find a positive integration between the two. So yeah. No, I think it's such an important, such a big topic, and I think I'd definitely really interested, really grateful for you for joining us and sharing some of these perspectives, and kind of, I hope it opens up thinking a bit. I think opening up questions is a part of this, and different questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh no, really, thank you for joining us. If people want to get in touch with you, I think in the show notes we've got your LinkedIn profile and your podcast as well, which if you want to talk briefly about either of those or anything, then yeah.
Sure. Yeah, my podcast is called Design Feeling as opposed to Design Thinking, because we do a lot of thinking in the industry, but I think we need to do a bit more feeling as well. But basically, the reason I started my podcast was, I think we have so much focus on external factors in the design industry, like our craft, our users, our clients, our products. But a lot of times in this chaos, we tend to ignore the needs of ourselves as designers. So that's why I call it, who is the human behind the human-centered designer. So I'm trying to kind of bring the focus back to this human and help have conversations with experts around self-awareness, creative confidence, and meaning, things that we don't usually talk about. So yeah, if you're interested, do check it out and let me know what you think.
Thank you. And I do very much recommend the podcast. And I was also lucky enough to be a guest on there, which was a really fascinating conversation. So yeah. Yeah,
and I would also maybe like to recommend a few resources. So one of them is a book called Designing Your Life. I'm not sure if you can see it, but this is a book by Bill Burnett and Dave Evans from the D School at Stanford University. And they're basically written a book about how to apply the design principles and techniques on designing your own life. There's also a concept called systems thinking that's been really helpful for me to be able to zoom in and out intentionally to look at other players in the ecosystem and look at the big picture. And that's really been helpful in my career in terms of helping me see that big picture and not just focus on the details of my craft and see the big impact I'm having. And thirdly, I recently read a book called 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman. And in this book, he talks about, 4,000 weeks is basically the average lifespan of a human being, which is like around 80 years. And he says how it's not really a long time. We don't have much time on this planet. So spend time on what really matters. A lot of times, the things we're spending time on, it's probably not the thing that actually bring you joy and meaning. So a really fascinating book that I highly recommend.
And I think particularly, thank you. I really like that. And I think for me, one of the messages that is worth repeating, partly because I'm not entirely sure I've fully internalized it yet. In fact, I definitely haven't fully internalized it yet, is that the things that I enjoy and value can be valuable for other people, and that you can make a living from, and they can be helpful for other people too. And I think, being able to move in that direction and shift things in that direction is a healthy thing for everyone.
Absolutely.
So yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, please do, if you're in the audience, please do check out Nirish's podcast and everything else that he's doing. It's really cool. I hope that did get you thinking in the definitely really thought-provoking episode for me. And if it did, reach out and get in touch.
It definitely got me thinking. So thank you for your wonderful questions. I mean,
thank you.
You always ask the best questions that really kind of gets me deep inside me. So thank you so much for that. It's been very insightful for me as well, having this chat with you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Yeah, I think it's always a co-created thing, and to bring the audience into that, it really is a co-created. It's a community thing. It's the support of the audience that makes it possible, or at the very least legitimizes my excuse to talk to interesting people like Nirish.
And vice versa.
Yeah. You can check out upcoming and past episodes on YouTube and LinkedIn. And the podcast is still out of date, and I am still working on a solution to that, but we will get there eventually. Next episode, I'm going to be talking to Robbie Swale, who is a coach, author, and podcaster. And very interestingly, we're going to be talking about the concept of the heroic leader. And I feel like this is actually, very closely related. It's funny how these things often end up that way. That idea of the heroic designer, problem solver, feels quite closely related, and there's so much stuff about this kind of going above and beyond, almost being superhuman. And I don't think that's a helpful way to think about leadership when we are human, when we are all human. It's not a helpful way to work. So I'm really looking forward to getting to that. That's going to be at live at 1 p.m. UK time on Thursday, the 10th of November. So I very much hope to see you all then. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks and goodbye.